In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up state management for your Vue.js 3 app by using the composition API instead of using Vuex. I'll also give you 3 pros and 3 cons for using this technique instead of Vuex. If you're new here, my name's Danny. I'm an indie app developer and creator of Fudgeit. If you want to learn about Vue.js, web development, cross-platform apps and all that good stuff, click subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss anything. Every subscription helps me to create more content for this channel. So what we're going to do here is set up this basic counter app using the composition API at the component level by setting up some reactive data and methods. And then we're going to move all of our data and methods into a custom state management store, which we're going to create using the composition API instead of using Vuex. And we'll also be adding some Vuex-style state methods and getters to our store as well. And this is basically the same app I created in my Learn Vuex in 30 minutes video, which you might want to check out. Let's get started by creating a new Vue 3 project using the Vue CLI. So I'm just going to Google Vue CLI and jump to the website, get started, installation. And if you don't have Node installed, then you need to install that, which you can get at nodejs.org. Probably want to install the one on the left. And you can then install the Vue CLI in your terminal by using this command. And once that's installed, you should be able to create a new Vue project with the vue create command. So I'm going to jump to my terminal, which is just running within VS Code, which is the editor I'm using. And you want to make sure you're in the folder where you store your projects and then just run vue create. And let's call it composition API state management. And I'll fire that. And we want to choose manually select features. And we want to enable the router with the spacebar and disable the linter. And then just hit enter. And we want to choose Vue 3. Choose no to history mode, dedicated config files. Save this as a preset. I'm going to choose no. Okay, it's finished creating our project. So we just need to run npm run serve in that folder. And I can see the folder here, and I can see I've called it management instead of management. So I'm just going to rename that and then drag this folder into my editor, open up the terminal and just run npm run serve. And that's now running, so we can just command and click on this link and see the basic Vue.js app running in the browser. Let's get started by creating a basic counter app on this home page. So I'm going to jump to source and views and home.view. And I'm going to get rid of this hello world component, which is adding all of this text down here. I'll get rid of this import. And I'll get rid of this components object as well. And I'll save that. And we can actually delete that hello world component in the components folder. So I'll delete that. Okay, so let's add a counter to this page. So after this Vue logo image, I'm going to add a div with a class of counter, and I'll just put 0 in there for now. And let's add some buttons for decreasing and increasing the counter. So I'll add a div with a class of buttons, and then inside there I'm going to add a couple of buttons, one which has a minus symbol inside it and one which has a plus symbol. And I'll save that, and let's add a little bit of style to make these things a little bit bigger. So first I'll style the div element just to put a bit of space between each of the divs. So I'll just add a margin bottom, set that to 10 pixels. And let's make our counter a little bit bigger. So we'll target the counter div with this counter class. And I'll set the font size to 80 pixels. And let's make these buttons a little bit bigger. So I'll target the button element inside that div with a class of buttons. I'll set the font size to 40 pixels. I'll set the width to 100 pixels. And we'll add a bit of horizontal margin as well. So I'll set the margin to 0 on the y-axis and 10 pixels on the x-axis. Okay, this is looking decent enough now. So let's make this actually work by setting up some reactive data and some methods. And I'm going to be using the composition API for this. And if you need to learn the basics of the composition API, then check out my composition API versus options API video. So we're going to need a setup method. So I'll add that to our export here. And I'm going to set up a ref for our counter. So we need to import the ref method from Vue. We'll set up a ref for our counter. So we'll call this counter and set that equal to the ref method and pass in our initial value for that ref. So we'll just set it to 0. And to make this available to our template, we need to return it. So I'll add a return object and just pass in counter. And I'll save that. We can now replace this hard-coded 0 with our ref. So I'll add double curly braces and then counter and save that. Just reload it. And we can still see 0 here. So if I change this value to 2, then we see it update. So that's all hooked up. Set that back to 0. So let's trigger some methods when these buttons are clicked. So I'm going to add some click handlers to these buttons. I'll just select them both here and add a click handler. And on the plus button, we want to trigger a method called, let's say, increase counter. And then on the minus button, we'll trigger a method called decrease counter. So we'll just change it there. So now we need to set up these methods. So we'll make these constants. So const increase counter, set that equal to a function. And for now, I'll just log out increase counter. Then I'll just duplicate this and set up our decrease counter function and change the log as well. And because we're using these methods in our template, we need to return them here. So we just need to return decrease counter and increase counter. So I'll save that and let's just see if these functions are being triggered. And yeah, we can see decrease counter and increase counter in the console. So what do we want to do in these methods? Well, in this increase counter method, we just want to increase the value of this counter ref by 1. However, when we create a ref like this and assign it to a variable, it actually creates an object. And within that object is a property called value. And that's where our value is for that ref. So in this increase counter function, we just want to do counter.value to get access to the actual value, and then plus plus to increase it by 1. So I'll just copy this and paste it into the decrease counter function and change that to minus minus. And let's save that and see if it's working. Yep, the plus button is working and the minus button is working as well. Okay, so our app is basically working. Let's create a state management store for all of our data and methods using the composition API instead of using Vuex, so that we can access all of our data and methods from anywhere within our app and not just on this homepage. So I'm going to create a new folder within the source folder called store. And inside that, I'm going to create a file called index.js. And this is where we're going to create our store. So we're going to need somewhere to store our data or our state. So let's create an object called state where we can place our counter property. So I'll add a counter property here and set it to 0. And we need to export this object. So I'll add an export default and pass in this state object. And we need this state object to be reactive, so that if any of the properties in this state object change, then any of the components in our app which are using properties from that state object will be updated straight away. And we can do this by making this state object a reactive object using the composition API's new reactive method. And if you want to learn more about reactive objects, check out my composition API video. And all we need to do is import the reactive method from Vue. So import reactive from Vue. And then we just want to fire this reactive method on this object. So we can just add reactive and then surround this object in parentheses and save that. And this object is now reactive. So we've created our store and we've added our state object and made it reactive. And we want this store to be available everywhere within our app. And one way we could do this is by importing our store into our root Vue component, app.vue, and then using the provide method to make the store available to all of app.vue's child components, since all of the other components of our app will be children of app.vue. So I'm just going to add a script section to app.vue, and we want to import our store from this index.js file in the store folder. So we can just do import store from then app, which is an alias to our source folder, and then slash and then store. And now we want to use the provide method to make this store available to all of the child components of app.vue. And using the options API, we could do it like this by just adding a provide object and then passing in this store variable. However, since we're doing everything with the composition API, let's do this the composition API way. So we're going to need to import the provide method from Vue to do this. So we want to import provide from Vue, and then we can just get rid of this provide object and add our setup method. And then we can just fire the provide method and then pass in a name for the variable that we're going to provide as a string. And we're just going to call this store. And then for the second parameter, we just pass in the value that we're going to assign to this variable, which again is this store that we're importing here. So I'll save that. And we can now inject this store into any of the child components in our app. So let's inject it into our home page first. So I'm going to jump back to home.vue. And to inject this, we're going to need the inject method from Vue. So I'll just pass that in here, inject. And then in our setup method, we can set up a constant for our store, and we'll call it store. And we'll set that equal to the inject method and pass in store as a string. And we also need to return this store constant in our return statement here. So I'll just add that here and save that. And we should now have access to our store within our homepage using this store constant. So first of all, let's replace this counter, which is currently using this local counter variable here, with the counter property, which is in our state, in our store. So this property is going to be at store.state.counter. So I'll jump back to home.vue and jump up to our counter here. And let's replace this counter with store.state.counter. Save that. And I'll just reload the page. And we can still see a 0 on the page here. So if I jump back to index.js, change the value of this counter to 4, then we see it update. So we're now successfully using the counter from our store instead of the counter that's on the home page. So I'll set this back to 0, save that, jump back to home.vue, and we don't need this local counter variable anymore. So let's get rid of that and also get rid of it from this return statement as well and save that. Okay, let's move our methods into our store now. So I'm going to jump back to the store file, and we could, if we wanted to, set up an object for mutations and an object for actions if we wanted to keep this really similar to Vuex. But I want to demonstrate that when we use the composition API to set up state management, we can do things quite differently from Vuex, and we can set things up however we want to. So instead of having mutations and actions, I'm just going to have an object called methods and place all of our methods inside that object. So I'll set up a new constant called methods, set that equal to an object, and we need to add this methods object to our export here. So I'll add that here. And we can now place all of our methods inside this object. So we need a method for increasing the counter. So let's create a method called increase counter, and I'll just duplicate that, add a comma here, and change this one to decrease counter. And all we want to do in these methods is either increase this counter in our state by 1 or decrease it by 1. So in this increase counter method, we can just do state.counter plus plus. And then in the decrease counter method, we can just do state.counter minus minus. And I'll save that. And we should hopefully be able to trigger these methods from anywhere within our app where we're injecting our store. So let's trigger these methods that are in our store when the user clicks on these buttons. So I'll jump to these buttons and these click handlers. And instead of triggering these local methods, let's trigger the methods that are in our store. So these are going to be at store.methods and then .increase counter or .decrease counter. So I'll jump back to home.vue, and on our plus button, we want to trigger store.methods.increase counter. And then the same for the decrease counter. So we just want to do store.methods.decrease counter. And we can now get rid of these local functions that we're not using anymore. So I'll get rid of both of these. and get rid of them from this return statement as well, and save that. And let's see if this is working. Yeah, it seems to be working. We can increase and decrease the counter. So now that all of our data and methods are in this global store, we should now be able to use any of our state properties or any of our methods anywhere within our app. So just to demonstrate that, let's just stick a counter on the about page. So I'm going to open up the about page, source views about.vue. And again, we need to inject our store into this component like we did on the home page. So let's add our script section and our export, add our setup method, and we need to import the inject method from Vue. And then in our setup method, we need to set up a constant for our store, set that equal to the inject method, and pass in store as a string. And then we need to return this store constant. So we'll add a return object and pass in the store. I'll save that. And I'll change the text in this h1 to counter works everywhere. And then I'll add a h2 and we'll just spit out our counter. So again, store.state.counter. And I'll save that. And we can see our counter there. So if we jump to the home page and increase this counter, jump back to the about page, we can see that it's been updated. If you found this video useful so far, smash the like button and leave a comment telling me whether you prefer using Vuex for state management or using the composition API. So when we use Vuex for state management, as well as state, mutations, and actions, we also have getters, which can get some data from our state, change it or filter it in some way, and then make that available everywhere within our app. So let's add a getter to our custom store. So let's say we want to spit out the square of our counter, so the counter multiplied by itself. Well, we could create a getter to do that for us. But first, I'm just going to add some markup first for displaying the counter squared. So I'm going to jump to home.vue, and then after this counter div, I'll add another div with a class of counter squared. And inside that, I'll first of all spit out the counter, store.state.counter. Then I'll add a space and a new line and a superscript tag with 2 in it, which should look like a squared symbol. Then I'll add a space and an equals, then a space and a new line. And for now, I'll just put XXX, but we'll replace this with the value from our getter later on. So I'll save this, and that looks pretty decent. So let's create a getter, which will grab the square of our current counter. So I'll jump back to index.js, and I'm going to create a new object here called getters. So const getters equals object, and we need to export this, so we'll add that here as well. Let's create a method in here called counter squared, and we just want to return something here, and we want to return the counter multiplied by itself. So we can just return state.counter multiplied by state.counter, and I'll save that, and hopefully this getter should be available on our home page. So I'll jump back to home.vue, and I'll replace this XXX with double curly braces. And our getter is going to be at store.getters.counter squared. So we can just put store.getters.counter squared. And in Vuex, we didn't need to put parentheses after this function name because Vuex automatically resolved it to a function. But with this custom solution, we are going to have to add the parentheses like that. So I'll save that. And it seems to be working. 5 squared is 25. 6 squared is 36. Let's set up some two-way data binding with our store. So let's create an input where the user can enter a color name or a color code, which will then change the color of our counter. So first, let's add a new state property in our store. So I'll jump to index.js and add a new property to our state called color code. And we'll just set this to blue. I'll save that. And now let's bind to the style attribute on our counter and set the color to whatever's in this color code property. So I'll jump to home.vue, and I'm going to split the attributes on this counter div using the split HTML attributes extension. And we'll bind to the style attribute. I'm going to pass in an object, and we want to change the color CSS property, and we want to set it to whatever's in this color code property. So we want to set it to store.state.colorcode. So I'll just set this to store.state.colorcode, Save that. And we can now see our counter is blue because we have it set to blue here. If we change this to red, then it changes to red. So let's add an input to our home page and bind it to this color code property so that the user can change the color. So I'll jump to home.view. Then after our buttons div, I'll add another div and I'll put an input in there and I'll split the attributes and I'll add a placeholder which just says enter color code. Save that and we can see that on the page. So how can we bind this input to this color code property in our state? Well, one potential advantage here over using Vuex is that we can just use vmodel to directly bind this input to this state property. So we don't need to set up a computed property and bind it to this input and then add a get method and a set method to that computed property like we need to do with Vuex. Because with Vuex, we're only allowed to mutate the state by using a mutation. But with this custom solution, we don't necessarily need to do that. So I'll jump back to home.view and to this input, and we can just go ahead and add a vmodel to this and set it to this state property. So store.state.colorcode. So store.state.colorcode. I'll save that and I'll reload. So if we change this field now to blue, then it's updating the color code property in our state and we see the color of the counter change. So you might see this as an advantage, being able to two-way bind with our state properties without too much hassle. However, you may want to protect your state from outside mutations so that we can only actually change state properties using methods that are in this store, just like Vuex does. And we can do that if we want to. We can do this by using VueJS's read-only method, so that when we export our state here, we only export a read-only copy of our state, so that any attempt to change the state from outside of this store file will fail and return an error. So to do this, we need to import the read-only method from Vue. So we can just add that here, read-only. And then down in our export, when we add state here, what it's basically doing is creating an object property called state and then setting it to state, this state object here. So what we can do to export a read-only copy of this state is just simply fire the read-only method on this state object here. So we can just surround this in read-only and parentheses, and we should now no longer be able to change the state or mutate the state from outside of this store. So I'll save that and I'll reload. And if we now try to change this input, we can see the color of the counter doesn't change, and we see some warnings in our console. Set operation on key color code failed. Target is read-only. So now our store is completely protected from outside mutations, just like the state in Vuex is. But now that it is protected, if we want to make a change to this color code property, then we're going to need to bind this input to a computed property with a get method and a set method. A get method for just grabbing the initial value from our state, and then a set method which will be triggered whenever this field changes, which then passes the new value in the input to a method that's in our store, which then updates the color code data property. So I'm going to jump back to home.view and this input, and instead of binding it directly to our state property, let's set up a computed property called color code, and we'll create that in our setup method. And so we're going to need the computed method from Vue to do this. So I'll pass that in here. And I've just realized we're not using the ref method anymore, so we can get rid of that as well. And so let's set up this computed property, color code. So to do this, we can just fire the computed method, pass in an object, and we want to assign this to a constant or a variable, and we want to assign it to a constant called color code. So I'll just add const color code equals, and we need to return this computed property, so I'll pass it into our return statement as well, color code. And let's add a get method and a set method to this computed property. So get, then a comma, and then set. So inside the get method, we just want to return the value that's in this state property. So we just want to return store.state.colorcode. So I'll just do that, return store.state.colorcode, and I'll save that. and refresh. And that seems to be working because this input is populated with red, which is the initial value of this property. So I'll jump back to home.view, and this set method will be fired every time this input changes, and it will return the latest value of that input. So we just need to pass in a variable name here. I'll just call it val, but you can call it whatever you want. And I'll just log out val, make sure that's working. So if we start typing into this input, then we can always see the latest value of the input being logged out. So now we just want to send this latest value to a method that's in our store, in our methods object, which will then update our color code property with the latest value. So I'll jump back to home.view. And so when this set method is fired, every time the input is changed, we just want to trigger a method that's in our store, which we've not created yet. So let's trigger a method called setColorCode. So we just want to do store.methods.setColorCode, and then we want to pass in the latest value like this. So I'll save that. And now we need to create this method, setColorCode. So I'll jump back to index.js and add this setColorCode method, which is going to be expecting a value. And all we want to do in here is set this color code property to this value. So we can just do state.colorCode equals val. So I'll save that, and hopefully this is working now. I'll reload, change the value of this input, and yeah, the counter changes to blue. So that all seems to be working now. Okay, so this is basically how we can set up state management using the composition API instead of using Vuex. But before you start creating projects in this way, it's important to understand the pros and cons of using this technique instead of Vuex. So I have 3 pros and 3 cons. And pro number 1 is that we can structure this store however we want to. We can give all of these objects any names we want. We don't need to use state, methods, and getters. And we don't even need to place our methods inside an object like this if we don't want to. We can just declare our functions at the root level and export them down here if we want to. And we could add all sorts of different objects for different purposes. So you might have one object for one kind of method and then one object for a different kind of method. So we really have almost infinite flexibility with how we set up our store if we use this technique. And pro number 2 is that we're not forced into using mutations and actions. So with a larger Vuex app, we often end up with tons of mutations and actions which all have the same names. And many of those actions are just simply passing a payload onto the mutation, which can make your store feel quite bloated with a lot of kind of unnecessary code. But with this technique, we're not forced into doing that. Although we still have the option to break our store up into mutations and actions if we prefer to. Pro number 3 is that we can two-way bind with properties that are in our state if we're using this technique, which could be quite handy and could mean that we avoid having to set up lots of different computed properties and binding our inputs to those computed properties. However, if we do want to protect our state from outside mutations like Vuex does, then we still have the option to do that by using the read-only method. Okay, so now for the cons. So con number 1 is that we don't have all of the excellent debugging capabilities that we have with Vuex. So when we use Vuex, we can use the Vue dev tools to see everything that's going on within our state, and we can even change our state properties from Vue dev tools. We can see exactly which mutations are being fired and exactly which components triggered those mutations. And we can even step back in time through all of our mutations. And with our composition API store, we don't have any of these capabilities. And con number 2 is that we don't have access to Vuex plugins, such as the Vuex persisted state plugin, which makes it really easy for us to persist the user's state in the user's browser in local storage. Although we could recreate that functionality with a little bit of extra work. And con number 3 is that we need to inject our store into every component which uses it, which does add a little bit of extra code. Whereas with Vuex, we don't need to inject our store or import it or anything. We always have immediate access to everything that's in our store by default. So that's all of my pros and cons. If you can think of any more, then please leave a comment down below. Make sure you check out my Learn Vuex in 30 minutes video. Check out my video on the basics of the composition API as well. Please click my face over there and subscribe. Every subscription helps me to create more content for this channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.